At first, it seemed like the kind of case small towns believe they were prepared for. A single incident, one timeline, one explanation that felt sufficient. The town of Redwood Falls had fewer than 10,000 residents. It was the kind of place where routines mattered, where neighbors noticed when something felt out of place. So when a local business owner failed to open his shop one Monday morning, concern spread quickly, but panic did not. By midday, police had located his car. By evening, they had a working theory. By nightfall, the town had already begun to move on. The case file was opened, summarized, and quietly labeled inactive within weeks. But what investigators didn't realize, what no one realized at the time, was that the case wasn't unfinished. It was incomplete. Years later, when fresh eyes would finally return to the evidence, one uncomfortable truth became clear. The problem wasn't a lack of clues, it was the assumptions made too early, and those assumptions would shape everything that followed. Investigators followed the path that made the most sense at the time. Financial records were reviewed, recent disagreements were noted, a timeline was constructed quickly, almost effortlessly. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, no clear indication of foul play. And that absence of chaos led to the first major conclusion: this was not a criminal act. The case shifted quietly from investigation to explanation. A medical event, a personal decision, an unfortunate coincidence. Each possibility was discussed, documented, and ultimately accepted, not because it was proven beyond doubt, but because it offered closure. And closure, especially in quiet towns, is powerful. But as months passed, subtle inconsistencies began to surface. Statements that didn't align, times that didn't quite match, details that had been glossed over because they complicated an otherwise tidy narrative. None of them were dramatic on their own, but together they formed the outline of something unfinished. The case might have remained dormant if not for one thing: memory. Years later, a retired officer reviewing old files noticed a discrepancy that had been overlooked, not ignored, but never questioned deeply enough. A timestamp, a witness statement logged twice, slightly differently each time. It wasn't evidence of wrongdoing, it wasn't proof of a crime, but it was proof of uncertainty. That discovery reopened conversations no one had expected to revisit. Former witnesses were contacted again, records were re-examined with modern tools, and for the first time, investigators approached the case without the pressure of immediate resolution. What they found was not a smoking gun, it was something far more unsettling. A pattern of missed opportunities, a chain of reasonable decisions that together had led investigators away from the truth, not toward it. The case wasn't unsolved because it lacked answers. It was unsolved because the right questions had never been asked.
When investigators reopened the file, they didn't start with suspects. They started with people. One name surfaced quietly in the margins of the original report, a witness interviewed briefly and never contacted again. At the time, their statement had seemed insignificant. They hadn't seen a crime, they hadn't heard an argument. They had simply noticed something unusual. A car parked where it didn't belong, at a time that didn't match the official timeline. Back then, the detail was dismissed as faulty memory. Years later, with distance and perspective, it became something else entirely. When investigators tracked the witness down, they found someone who had carried guilt for decades. They remembered being rushed through the interview, sensing that their observation complicated things rather than clarified them. This time, no one rushed. Their account didn't rewrite the case, but it bent the timeline just enough to expose its weakness. The original theory suddenly relied on assumptions that no longer held. For the first time, the case felt unstable. And instability meant opportunity. Timelines are the backbone of investigations. When they work, everything else falls into place. When they don't, nothing does. The original timeline of the case had been built quickly, based on routine, habit, and expectation, rather than verified movement. When modern analysts reconstructed it using updated methods, cracks appeared almost immediately. Phone records showed activity later than reported. Traffic cameras suggested a different route. Workplace logs contradicted assumed departure times. Individually, each inconsistency could be explained away. Together, they told a different story, where the simple explanation required more coincidence than reality usually allows. Investigators weren't looking for wrongdoing within the department. They were looking for truth. And the truth was becoming clearer. The case had been closed because it felt complete, not because it actually was. The timeline wasn't wrong out of negligence. It was wrong because no one had expected to need it later. To understand why the case stalled, investigators had to confront something uncomfortable, not a suspect, but a system. At the time of the original investigation, the department was under intense pressure. Resources were limited, public concern was rising, and leadership wanted reassurance, not uncertainty. A case without clear answers is a liability. So when a theory emerged that calmed fears and restored normalcy, it was embraced, not out of malice, but out of necessity. No one falsified evidence, no one silenced witnesses, but questions that slowed progress were quietly deprioritized. Years later, former officers admitted what they couldn't then. The investigation had ended not because it was finished, but because it was enough. Reopening the case meant revisiting those decisions, and doing so required courage, not just professionally, but personally. The turning point didn't come from a breakthrough. It came from perspective. A new investigative team, unconnected to the original case, approached the file with history or expectation. They weren't invested in defending past conclusions. They were interested only in accuracy. They asked questions others hadn't. They revisited assumptions no one had challenged. They treated every obvious detail as suspect. And slowly, a clearer picture emerged, not of a perfect crime, but of a misunderstood one. The case hadn't resisted resolution, it had simply been misunderstood. For the first time in decades, investigators weren't asking what happened, they were asking why the truth had been missed. And that question would lead them closer than anyone had ever been.
Every long-running investigation has a moment that defines its future. In this case, it wasn't a crime scene or a suspect interview. It was a decision made quietly during a routine meeting early in the investigation. Records showed that investigators had once debated two competing theories. One was straightforward, familiar, and supported by circumstantial alignment. The other was complex, uncomfortable, and required admitting uncertainty. They chose the first, not because it was proven, but because it allowed the case to move forward. Years later, when analysts revisited that decision, they realized something crucial. The second theory hadn't been disproven, it had simply been set aside. And when modern investigators reconstructed it from scratch, it accounted for details the accepted theory never could. Movements that once seemed random suddenly made sense. Witness statements that felt unreliable now aligned. The case wasn't missing evidence, it was missing context. That early decision hadn't ended the investigation, it had quietly redirected it away from the truth. Some evidence means nothing when it's collected. Time changes that. A small item logged into storage decades earlier, a note, a receipt, a recorded interaction, had been cataloged and forgotten. It wasn't ignored, it just didn't fit the story investigators believed at the time. When the cold case unit re-examined it, they noticed something subtle. The item didn't contradict the official timeline, it contradicted the assumptions behind it. The date mattered more than anyone realized. The location suggested intent, not coincidence. The wording implied awareness investigators never accounted for. This wasn't a missing clue. It was a clue that needed distance to be understood. Suddenly, the case gained depth. What once looked like randomness now showed planning. What seemed unconnected now shared a common thread. The case wasn't unsolved because it lacked answers. It was unsolved because the answers arrived out of order. As investigators placed the overlooked details side by side, something emerged. A pattern. Not dramatic, not obvious, but consistent. The same delays, the same points of hesitation, the same moments where progress slowed without explanation. It wasn't a conspiracy, it was human behavior. Each time the case approached uncertainty, it was gently steered back toward familiarity. Each time ambiguity appeared, it was framed as coincidence. The pattern revealed why the case resisted closure. Resolving it required admitting that earlier conclusions were incomplete. That kind of admission doesn't come easily, especially when years of trust, reputation, and public reassurance are involved. But recognizing the pattern changed everything, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. For decades, the case existed in fragments, spread across reports, memories, and archived files. What finally moved it forward wasn't new evidence, it was organization. Investigators consolidated everything, every statement, every timestamp, every decision, into a single coherent narrative.
For the first time, the case could be seen all at once. And when that happened, its weaknesses became visible. The gaps weren't random. The contradictions weren't minor. They clustered around the same moments. This wasn't failure. It was progress. Because a case that can be fully understood, even in its flaws, is a case that can finally be resolved. The truth wasn't longer buried. It was waiting.
The turning point didn't arrive with a confession or a dramatic arrest. It came quietly. While reviewing the reconstructed timeline, investigators noticed a narrow window, less than an hour, where all known movements overlapped in a way no one had previously tested. It was a moment dismissed decades earlier as insignificant. But when modern data analysis was applied, mapping traffic patterns, visibility, and known routines, the window became critical. For the first time, investigators could explain why certain witnesses were close but never quite present, why evidence appeared delayed, not misplaced, why early assumptions felt logical yet incomplete. The case hadn't stalled. It had paused at the exact point where technology and perspective hadn't yet caught up. Now they had. One of the most delicate steps in reopening the case was addressing the past, not to assign blame, but to understand decisions. Investigators interviewed retired officers, supervisors, and early witnesses. What emerged wasn't negligence or corruption, but pressure. Pressure to reassure the public, pressure to show progress, pressure to close a case in a town that couldn't afford uncertainty. The new team didn't erase the past, they contextualized it, and in doing so, they restored trust, both within the department and the community. This wasn't about correcting mistakes, it was about completing unfinished work. When all the evidence was finally aligned, old and new, physical and circumstantial, a conclusion emerged. Not a theory, an answer. It explained the overlooked behaviors, the inconsistent timelines, the silence that followed certain moments. Most importantly, it explained why the case resisted closure for so long. Because the truth didn't contradict the past, it expanded it. The case was never fully solved because it was never fully understood, until now. The department formally updated the case status, acknowledging the correct sequence of events and the reality behind the mystery. For the first time, the story made sense, from beginning to end. Victory didn't come as celebration, it came as peace. Families received answers, not speculation. The town received honesty, not reassurance. And the department reclaimed something more important than closure: credibility. The case that once haunted the station no longer lived in whispers or unanswered questions. It became a reminder that truth doesn't expire, that patience matters, and that sometimes solving a case isn't about discovering something new, but having the courage to look again. The case was finally solved, not perfectly, but truthfully.